Are you an impatient plant grower? Are you the kind of person who's sitting there going, why am I not getting a new leaf yet? Or are you a plant grower that really enjoys the plants that take their time, just get to experience them as they are for as long as possible before they bring out the new foliage, and then they'll take their time to bring out the new foliage? Either way, stick with me and let's look at some of the plants that, at least in my experience, tend to be slow growers. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today's video is going to be an interesting one. I'm going to say I'm going to try and keep it positive. I'm probably not going to keep it positive because I'm the impatient type that I was talking about just a moment ago. So for me, these plants infuriate me. For other people, though, I don't want to take this away from them. For other people, this is a thing that they enjoy. I know a lot of people that sometimes when I mention and I make comments about some of my other videos about plants that take a long time, they're just like, but why do you mind? We quite enjoy it. Great. This also works for you as well. But I just want to talk through some of the plants that I've had in my care that I've got to experience substantially slow growth. And there's going to be a few that might be of interest that kind of sometimes have slow growth. And on that kind of very ominous note, let's look at one of the first plants that I want to be talking about, which is one that I no longer have in my care, which is the Philodendron Lupinum. I'll start off strong with one that I'm probably going to complain about. That's the proper word that I can use on YouTube. So this is a plant that, when it's in its juvenile form, looks very similar to a red-backed Philodendron micans. It can transform when it gets older to a very different leaf structure, which is what a lot of people get the more juvenile forms for. In my experience, and that's why I'm starting with this one first, by far the slowest growing plant I have ever owned. And I've also heard similar stories from a lot of you, basically, where you're just like, yeah, Philodendron Lupinum, it's been 1.5 years and I'm still waiting for a new leaf. I mean, not to say, because my kind of question in this is a bit like, how does this plant survive in nature? It cannot just be that stagnant in terms of its growth and take so long to do anything or grow new foliage. But the realist in me, and possibly the person who has a bit of a scientific background, probably would say none of us have got its care right, basically. Or, to be probably more kind to all of us, this plant probably needs very specific growing conditions in order for it to kind of grow at its best potential, basically, which might be something that none of us are able to achieve in households, in conservatories, in kind of IKEA grow cabinets, basically. Yeah, it's obviously something that it needs that maybe we're not providing it. It might be that it's from a higher altitude, so it needs cooler nighttime temperatures. I never really went into finding out a bit more about this plant because by the time I'd already lost hope with this, I'm just like, I could do more research and see what I'm doing wrong. But at this point, do I care? No. Philodendron Lupinum, by far one of the slowest plants you'll ever grow in your collection. This is interesting as well, and this is why I thought I'd do this video, because when you're first starting off with houseplants and everybody's just like, yeah, you know, your Sansevierias or now Dracaenas, the snake plants are very slow in their growing sometimes. In my experience, not always. It just depends on the light level that you give it. A lot of the times with some of my snake plants, if I give it more in higher light levels than what most people tend to give them because they're meant to be low light plants, it grows a bit more fast and a bit more steadily, basically. Same thing goes with ZZ plants. And yes, ZZ plants in lower light conditions either don't grow at all or grow painfully slowly. I still think a ZZ plant grows faster than the lupinum. So do with that what you will. If you like the look of the lupinum and you are happy for it to look exactly the same months or even years after you bought it, great. This is a plant that could replicate an artificial plant for you. But yes, enough with the poo-pooing lupinum. Let's move on. The next one, I've got one behind me, so I will show you now. Monstera obliqua, Peru. And this is the second one. This is the one that I've got in soil, and I did talk about this in my plant roast video. This is a relatively, it surprised me. This plant wasn't available for the longest period of time, other to a very select few people that had the kind of money to pay for it. So probably not a lot was being said about this plant. But it is relatively slow growing. It runs all the time. So when you do finally get some growth from it, that part of it can be quite fast. It can be very quick at throwing out runners. But to bring out foliage, it can be tricky. And I have listened to the comments that you guys all had in my video, which was the plant roasts, about what to do to maybe get it to grow a bit better, to maybe not have it run quite as much. But I have heard that, but it still doesn't negate the fact that this is a plant that can be quite slow growing. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because this has become a lot more readily available and a lot more affordable for a lot of people in recent months. So for me, this is no longer kind of the ultimate difficult plant to get. This is a plant that you're more than likely to come across, and you probably will purchase it these days. I think it's worth noting that this can be quite slow. And just to give you some context, I think it's been 3 months since I've owned this plant. Same foliage. I had like 4 or 5 very long runners. I've cut those off and I'm trying to propagate them again. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, this is a slow one. And it's interesting because most Monsteras, at least in my experiences, aren't that slow. And I say this as we go into a Monstera that is slow again, and I will add a picture here because it's buried right in where my shelves are, basically the Monstera species, or Monstera spa Peru, basically. And this is one that can be quite slow growing. I would actually put this on par with Sansevieria speed and even the ZZ plant speed as well. And this is one that probably you might find a bit more readily available, at least here in the UK and Europe. I don't know in the States or around other parts of the world, but this is one that you can generally find it. It's usually not called a Monstera spa Peru, at least in my experience. This was called the Epipremnum marble planet, but it is a Monstera spa Peru. This can be quite slow growing. I also challenge you to see if you can find mature pictures of this plant. A lot of the time, at least back when I was searching, there is very little to find in terms of mature pictures of this plant, because I don't think it's been in people's collections, or it doesn't grow that fast for those types of pictures to exist. Coming on to the plant that I have got behind me, which is, it's not the slowest growing Anthurium, but it does take its time. The Anthurium warocqueanum, or the Queen Anthurium, is one that, in my experience at least, with the larger foliage like this, basically, it does take a while, not necessarily to grow a new leaf, for a new leaf to emerge, but for that new leaf to then harden off and then be a fully matured leaf to then bring out another leaf. So this is one that can be slow at times, so be forewarned if you think that you're going to get one and it's going to grow loads of leaves really quickly. In my experience, that is not the case. I have got another one for you again, a plant that I no longer have. I did manage to grow mine to quite a large size, and I think I've got a video. I will add it to the top somewhere there. I just lost love with this plant, and I think I ended up like gifting this to somebody else who really wanted one. The the Scindapsus treubii Moonlight, the one that I had, the kind of silvery green one. I wanted the dark form, which wasn't very available at that point, but people that did have the dark form on that video were actually commenting, if you think the treubii is slow, which it is, The dark form is even slower. So there's like, no. Scindapsus treubii, Moonlight, is very slow growing, basically. It can also, in my experience and a lot of other people's experience, especially when it was growing, coming in from growers back then, they were massively overwatering them. It was pure cocoa coir as well, which caused an awful lot of root rot. And people would be like, oh, it's a Scindapsus. It should grow relatively quickly. But interestingly enough, I think having seen certain Scindapsuses that are out there, people kind of get that assumption because there were the Scindapsus pictus or the argyraeus, the Scindapsus, I'll put a picture here, that most people can commonly find. So they're usually called the velvet pothos. It's not a pothos, but that plant there can be quite fast growing. In my experiences, most other Scindapsuses that I have had experiences with, not just the treubii, tend to be much slower than that. So that's possibly something to bear in mind, that maybe as a genus of plants as a whole, they tend to be a bit slower growing. Think of genuses like, and I'm not going to mention any Hoya in this video, I could put quite a few Hoyas here, but Hoyas can be quite slow growing plants. Again, not all of them. So for instance, the Hoya pollinura, and I've got hopefully a picture to add here, the Hoya linearis is another one that I find is quite fast for a Hoya. So there is that as well. There's always a caveat when we talk about Hoyas or wax plants that it's fast for a Hoya. It's still not super fast. It's not going to grow as quickly as, say, for instance, something like a golden pothos. So there is that to kind of bear in mind there as well. Another plant that can be quite slow, at least in my experience, and this is where we start coming into the kind of but under these conditions it can be kind of slow, is this plant here. So this is the Epipremnum pinnatum, I think it is, Cebu Blue, but the Cebu Blue Epipremnum, basically. So yes, and I know probably a lot of people are screaming at their screens saying now, it's not slow, it can be quite fast. Yes, but in my experience, after having grown at least 3 or 4 of them, and I might have just been me and I've had bad experiences, but if you are trying to propagate this and getting a rooted cutting and trying to get more leaves from it, this takes a while to get going. I think I've been growing this out for 2 years now. So that gives you an indication. So it's not a particularly difficult plant. It's still an Epipremnum, but I find that this, at least when you first get going, can be a bit slower. At least in my experience, it has been. The other one that I will add a picture here again because it's too buried in my collection, Amydrium medium. I've got the silver one, the bluey one. I think the regular green form is the same. I'm pretty sure the variegated form is the only one that's a bit faster. But the Amydrium medium, for similar reasons to the Monstera Obliqua Peru, it runs all the time. That one, I have at least had runners where eventually you'll get a leaf every so often. But yeah, this is a slow growing plant. So in a year of me owning this plant, I maybe got 5 leaves, 6 if I was lucky, and a lot of them came up at the same time. So there's a large period of time when you own this plant where it does very little or it's constantly bringing out runners. So there is that to remember about that plant. And again, falling into categories of things that can be slow but are not always slow in later years. And I'm trying to see if I can pick it up. I can't pick up that one. I will see if I can add a picture here. And this is one that a lot of people question me on because they're just like, but that's not my experience. The Philodendron Burle Marx Variegata, and there's a very specific time in its growing journey where it's slow, which is if you're getting something like a rooted cutting or you're rooting a cutting, it's a plant that I find does 0 up at the top in terms of foliage or any kind of new growth, whilst it's trying to establish its roots. And by that, at least again, based on my experience, you might be looking at 6 months to a year It might be that long. It might even be as long as a year, basically, because I've seen people that have gone, it's done nothing for a year and it's now exploding in growth. Philodendron Burle Marx Variegata needs, and I've done this through cuttings of my own mother plant, the big tree that I had behind me at some point in my earlier videos, needs time to establish itself before it starts growing like the clappers. So there's a positive to that if you're looking for something that's a bit more fast growing and you've got the patience to just hold on for a bit whilst it establishes itself, whilst it lays down its roots. That's a massively gratifying plant to have in your collection when it starts growing, because it just keeps on doing its thing, basically. It's also an interesting plant because even when it gets root rot, it's quite quick to bounce back, but it just needs a robust root system, and I do mean robust, basically. So if you've got root rot and you've lost all of its roots and you need to start from the beginning, guess what? You're going to be waiting for 6 months to a year, potentially, for it to fully root out again, to start getting that explosive growth. But even in those situations, because I've had similar situations to that, where I've taken much larger cuttings than I would normally take for a specific plant, and I've tried to root it out, it doesn't lose any of the foliage, even when it doesn't have any roots. It will take a bit longer to then root out, but it will still root out. But it is one that you do need to remember, that there is a slow period of not a lot happening foliage-wise with that plant in the beginning of its life, unless you've got an established plant that you've bought from somebody and it's fully rooted and growing actively. You're going to have to deal with that, basically. Ooh, and I've just seen a plant, and I'll see if I can get it out, actually. So a very, very small example of this, because this plant has nearly died on me from root rot 4 or 5 times, and these, it's always a cutting that I managed to salvage from it rooting out, and I repot it. Basically, this, I don't know if you might be able to see, is the Philodendron Subhastatum. And the Subhastatum, at least in my experience, and I've got it in semi-hydro now and it's growing roots, it's really interesting because I think it's a plant that, based on what I've seen, doesn't really like drying out too much. It doesn't like sapping wet, but it doesn't like drying out too much, but it will also go towards root rot really quickly, I find. Combine that with the fact that the foliage takes a while to mature. It also takes a while for new foliage to come out. So this is, again, there's a reason why I'm showing you this plant. It can be a very, very slow grower, but it is a beautiful plant. The other thing to remember with this one is that, and I didn't know this when I first got it, the more the foliage matures, and when I got this to a relatively large size, the more you lose that red at the back of the leaves. So, because I know I did a video a while back, and people were just like, but I thought it's meant to have more intense red. It does when it's more juvenile leaves. When it gets more mature, it will lose some of that telltale red back leaves, which I think is the reason why a lot of people really like this plant, because to be fair, the green part of the leaves is nothing to write home about, but you can see that red pop there is spectacular, basically. But it doesn't negate the fact that this is a slow-growing plant. To give you context, this was a cutting with maybe 1 leaf, and it's been rooting out and growing this much 2.5 years now. Yeah, does that paint the picture? This is one that I would say, if you can get an established, mature plant, start there, and it's a bit more rewarding then. But it's still a relatively slow-growing plant. So bear that in mind if you don't have the patience, and also bear that in mind if you are one that likes the slower-growing plants and kind of likes the world go by in its own time. This is a great one. Another plant that I no longer have in my care, and hopefully I will find a picture to put it here, and this is a nod towards the Alocasias, the Alocasia Black Velvet, if I'm not mistaken, which is a plant that a lot of people wanted to find. It's become a lot more readily available now in shops, but in my experience, probably one of my slowest growing Alocasias. It's beautiful, but it takes its time, basically. So if you want something that's similar vibes, there's a few other Alocasias, and I'll see if I can find the names and put them here, that have very similar aesthetics. They're not quite as dark or velvety as that leaf, but the texture-wise and the kind of overall look can be quite similar to this, and they are faster. I said I'll put it at the top there. I can't remember it now off the top of my head. But this is a relatively slow-growing alocasia, which is interesting because a lot of the times for most alocasias, even the jewel alocasias, which are smaller, the more kind of diminutive size alocasias, there's a certain speed to them. That one, in my experience, and it might be wrong, again, I encourage you throughout all this video, if you've had differing experiences than me, do let us all know down below, and maybe also share what your conditions are like in order for you to get those better or faster speeds, basically. But yeah, I think that's all the plants that I wanted to kind of talk through during my slow plant video. I didn't do any of the obvious, as I said earlier on, the snake plants and the ZZ plants and all of these things. I just wanted to highlight some of the plants that people might be looking to purchase to add to their collections that maybe they're not as aware that they can be quite slow. As I said, there will be differing opinions, and I am sure there's going to be a lot of conversation down in the comments below. But these have been my experiences in my care, in my conditions, basically. So doesn't necessarily mean I'm poo-pooing on this plant. Maybe the lupinum. I am poo-pooing on the lupinum. Oh. But there are definitely people out there who love these plants, and there's nothing to take away from the fact that they can be quite rewarding to a lot of different people. But again, if you're impatient like me, I would have loved a video like this to tell me, you know what, these plants take a bit longer to get going, so maybe if you don't have the patience, give these ones a miss, or go into it knowingly. Maybe not give it a miss necessarily, but go into it knowingly that these are going to be plants that you're going to be waiting for a while to get much of anything going on, basically. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.